Good evening, welcome everybody. My name is Rob. I'm a Free Stater, moved to New Hampshire less than 3 years ago. I'm delighted to be here. If anybody has any questions about New Hampshire, Free State project, what we're doing here, conference, please don't hesitate to ask me, of course, after the talk. And if I don't have the answer, I'll find somebody who does. Okay? Next up, Mike Vine is going to speak with us, or to us, about voluntary cartography. Why we should stop referring to places by the slave names. I'd like to introduce Mike. Mike is a lifelong libertarian activist who joined the movement at the age of 13. How many of us can say that? No, I forced my kids to join, but chose it at the age of 13. Mike is a BA in philosophy from Tulane. He's run a marketing communications consultancy for 3 years, and he's got a very impressive list of clients. Among them is Peter Schiff. Anybody doesn't know Peter Schiff?
Investor.
Yes, this guy. Mike is promoting Austrian economics and nullification, serving clients. He has 2 full-time associates and a network of freelancers. He's a founder and editor of The Free Coast and The Arcadia. He's appeared on Al Jazeera English, debating economic policy with socialist college professor, on Free Talk Live, right around the corner, discussing Arcadia, Porkfest, and the Society of Libertarian Entrepreneurs, and on Stossel, a segment about the FSP. Mike has written for the Tulane Hullabaloo and Lou Rockwell under his byline. His ghostwriting has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Smart Money, The Street, CNBC.com, CBS News, and elsewhere. Mike Vine was also the co-organizer, together with his wife, of the last Porkfest we had just this last summer. And for this, I thank you from the bottom of my heart. I still have cherished the experience. It was a great event. Thank you.
Try to get the lights down. A lot of visual. We're talking about cartography today. First, I want to thank you all for joining me for this fairly esoteric topic. I'm sure that most of you read it and said, well, I have no idea what this is, but it sounds kind of interesting, so I'll go. So here we are. So my first issue is forget building the roads. Without the state, most of you wouldn't know where you are. And that's a problem. So I'd like to start off with a little exercise here. How many of you, can any of you name where you are, just tell me where you are without referencing the state at all, or a place name that's claimed by a state?
So without referencing the city name?
Any place name that's claimed by a government.
Earth.
Okay. Can anyone be more specific?
The only thing I can think of, and I don't know the numbers, latitude and longitude.
Okay, that's an interesting way. All right, all right. Go ahead.
I live near Mount Kearsarge.
Good, all right.
River Valley.
Good, okay. So there's some ideas, but it's pretty difficult. I mean, if someone's not from your area, you know, giving them GPS coordinates might work, but they're probably a technical type person.
That depends on state-owned satellites.
That's true. There you go. Boom. So the point behind that is that language sets the boundaries in which debate can happen. This is something called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, or linguistic relativity. And basically, the gist behind it is it's not a hard rule, but this has been empirically demonstrated. That the way we think about things is shaped by our language and the words we have available to us. It won't prevent you from thinking of new ideas and breaking new ground, but most of us, most of the time, for practical reasons, are lazy thinkers. And we work within the cultural cues and currents that we know. Libertarianism is a great example of this. It's primarily an Anglosphere movement. It's in the English-speaking world. As the movement spreads, some other countries are getting institutes and so on, but you won't really see libertarianism as we know it outside of the English-speaking world. And why is that? Well, it could be that we had Locke and the French had Rousseau. We have within our body of work that are easily accessible to us and that we culturally relate to. A huge history of common law and certain traditions that allow us to formulate and accept libertarianism, whereas the continental European cultures have the civic law they got from the Romans. Asian cultures have been a series of empires, and that, that's what they see. And, they base their culture in Confucius and to some extent doing what you're told. Of course, I'm painting with broad strokes here, but so the point being that we are shaped by language, and it's important for us to address that aspect. Who we are is very tied in with where we are, and I'm going to get into that more, but for now I'll just say the governments know this, and that's why I believe they go after this very early and very aggressively to reinforce that we will not be able to describe where we are without referencing them. So, on a related note, in New York, the government refers to itself as the city, and this really grinds my gears. So, you say, well, the city should really pick up the trash, or you can't fight the city. So they're the city. Well, what does that make the rest of us? What does that make the people and the businesses and the families and the culture and the artists that make New York great? And that gets behind their mentality. They are the city, and we just live in it. That's coercive cartography. New York itself was a place name that was created by government mandate. It was the colony of New Amsterdam. Some people know this history, probably more in this room than in the general public. But the Dutch, when they settled New Amsterdam, were in the high period of a liberal golden age. And they actually basically bought their land from the natives. They engaged in trade. They formed a trading outpost. They named it New Amsterdam after the major city of the Netherlands. And it was only when the English forced their hand through war that they were forced to give up the colony, and the English renamed it New York. Well, why did they do that? Why is it important? And a lot of people, that's an objection. I've talked privately about this with some people. And you say, well, yeah, but do we have bigger battles to fight? Well, the state seemed to think it was pretty important to get an entire city full of Dutch-speaking people to refer to their town as a little town in northern England that they'd never seen or had anything to do with. It was actually named after the Duke of York, who was the brother's king, the king's brother, excuse me. Therefore reinforcing the sense of ownership of the state and the monarchy over these people. So what are some other ways that we can look at maps? Political boundaries are arbitrary, and they tend to squash the realities on the ground. This is a map of North American ecoregions, and it's one way to start to construct a geographic identity away from the state. As you can see, this looks nothing like the political map of the US, Canada, and Mexico. You've got states that are cut in half and Swiss cheese and sideways, and a big mess compared to the nice little squares that are painted by the politicians. But this is the actual reality on the ground. It's kind of a shame that we're left with very little way to describe ourselves in these terms when this is the actual environment that we're dealing with on a daily basis, whether we have 4 seasons, or we can wear t-shirts all the time, or whether we have to deal with mosquitoes, or there's not really that many bugs. This is our day-to-day life. Politicians don't care very much about that at all. Now, eco-regionalism is a movement that is starting to do what I would consider voluntary cartography. They're trying to get people to recognize their ecoregions and build their identities based off of it. Now, the ecoregional movement is a little more of the left than we're used to, so they also would like to align states, along these lines. And Cascadia, which I'll talk about later, in the Pacific Northwest, is one prominent example. But aside from the state formation aspect, I think a lot of what they're doing is really great. Just getting people talking about that, noticing the similarities of someone who lives, you know, right there, someone who lives right there, and how this guy really has very little to do with this guy on a daily basis, what they go through and the culture that's around them. So then we can look at, these are Native American regional cultures. And I think this map is fairly recognizable to us as, you know, we'll call it the Pacific Northwest and Northeast and Dixie, whatever the case may be. But these are cultural alliances that have gone back thousands of years in North America. Well, why would they look so similar to what we're used to today? It's because there's a strong interplay between geography and culture. While I don't believe in the noble savage, and I don't think that the native cultures were inherently more voluntary than our central states, they certainly did a lot fewer overseas murders, but they were more decentralized. That's just a fact. So I think they were able to show the reality on the ground a lot more. When they formed these alliances, it was based on, you know, well, I really have a lot more in common with this person than this person. They were constantly shifting, and that forms a kind of market. I think a lot of people here buy into that even if we had states, that smaller states are going to be more emergent and more adaptable. Okay. So now we flash forward to today. Starting in 1981, a fellow named Joel Garou kickstarted a lot of this discussion again by publishing a book called The 9 Nations of North America. I didn't misspell. I don't like his map as much, so I picked another one. But it's a similar idea. And what he said is that the United States is not one cohesive nation, but really 9 nations that are competing with each other for resources and recognition and just going about their lives in a very, very different manner. I like this map better. It's from a policy group in Massachusetts called Mass Inc. But you can start to see here's 10 nations, and what I find particularly neat about this one is if you look up here where we are in New Hampshire and Maine, they call that the sagebrush, which is tied in with the Mountain West, and then you have the Upper Coast culture. Now, besides the fact that I really do think New Hampshire and Maine have a lot to do with the rugged, individualist cowboy culture out west, and then the Upper Coast, you'll see the similarity of Silicon Valley and your Route 128 corridor in Boston. These are the regions that created the internet age working together. This isn't really a coincidence. Those regions in the Northwest were settled originally by people from where we are right now. There's a Portland here, there's a Portland there, also not a coincidence. These people, as they got in their wagons, they moved west, and these cultures are still linked to this day in a very strong way, and very severed from what goes on down here. And statistically, you can see anything from crime rates to foods, any sign of culture you want to choose, that life up here is very different than life down there, even though we're all forced to watch the same media from right there. So here's just another interpretation. If you're interested, there's tons of people who have tried, made maps, and you can Google online all the different ways that people have interpreted this. And the beautiful thing about voluntarism and voluntary cartography is that we don't have to have one right answer. And I think that's going to be we're going to talk about our regional project here, and I think people are used to thinking of maps as sort of exclusionary. There can only be one name, and just as we see in the market, there doesn't just have to be one postal service. We can have many different options that serve different needs. So I like this map. It's got New Netherland on it. It shows Yankee down as people spread across into the Midwest and the connection there. And this is based on more of a reading that there were founding cultures along the Atlantic seaboard, and then they carried their cultures as they went west, so you can see how they spread out. And really, again, that these people on those parallels have more in common with each other than they might with someone who's just a county away in their own state. So just to have some fun, here's another one. This is what you would call a sweetened carbonated beverage. And this map went around, if you saw it, but the red area is what people call it soda, blue is pop, and down in the deep south, they call everything Coke. So you go into a restaurant, you order Coke, and they say what kind, and you say 7-Up.
It's all bad.
So again, you're seeing, one thing you see, I think, a lot of the same patterns showing up again and again. You can see it linguistically, you can see it in soda, and they really have very little to do with the lines that the politicians have drawn. Yet another perspective. In the ancient world, people didn't identify with vast territorial states. Political life was organized around the polis, which was a region that had a city in the center where those kinds of scholarly and political things went on, and then its countryside. Country being, the etymology being opposite the city. So if we want to look at the US at least, in terms of palais, as they would say, then this starts to get at that. You can see that there are these megalopoli that have developed and form these cultural zones that are really, again, very independent from each other. I don't love this. It ties us into the Northeast madness. But the Piedmont Atlantic, this is a cultural region that a lot of people have moved out of the Great Lakes and moved down here, and this is basically like a brand new mega region. The Front Range, this was all empty land for the last 30, 40 years. And maps aren't going to take that into account. We're not going to start redrawing state lines to make a state that fits these people. Maybe we don't want to. Maybe we want lots of little states or no states at all. But should this person think of himself as a Georgian and have the most to do with someone down here, or should he recognize that there's a connection here and that we should share resources? Go ahead.
Just a quick question. What's an example of a city in that blue thing?
Piedmont Atlantic. So this is Atlanta,
Okay.
Birmingham, Charlotte. There's Asheville in there, Greenville. So this is that when everyone moves basically to get warm and because the unions killed the Midwest.
Is that map from what time frame is this map from?
Recent, but I don't have a year for you.
Okay.
I came across it a couple years ago and I just put it aside. But yeah, this is past few years.
And maybe you'll get to this. In a truly voluntary cartographic society, how might people reference, like if I wanted to say, like you and me are neighbors, how do I get to your house from my house? Plug it into my GPS. I'm trying to
That's in the weeds. We'll circle back to that.
Thank you.
Okay, so then you take ancient Greece as an example. So ancient Greece had a common language. They identified themselves as a common culture, but their political loyalties first were to their polis, whether that was Athens or Sparta, and so on. So talk about some regional successes. Who I think is succeeding at voluntary regionalism. Now, everyone's in the statist mindset. So the reality is that regional projects tend to have the end goal of having an independent state. But you put that goal aside, and I think these people are accomplishing some very good things for themselves. You have the constituent countries of the UK, which has seen a reawakening of their regional cultures in Wales. in Scotland, Northern Ireland, where they're rediscovering their language. They were for centuries suppressed by the English, and there's been this upwell, and it's a beautiful thing. Cascadia, I said I would get to, is a relatively new regional project started in the early 70s by some predominantly leftist college professors out of the University of Oregon. And they said, well, we've got the Pacific Northwest, but again, that name is just a reference to something else. We're the Pacific Northwest of the U.S., and British Columbia is not part of that. You know, they're a Canadian province. They're complete. Well, so that's not the reality on the ground. The reality is that we're all part of this temperate rainforest. We experience very similar conditions. It's had an effect on our culture, and we feel like we have a lot more in common between Vancouver, Seattle, and Portland than we do to cities to the south and east and west and east. So Cascadia has formed a model for Arcadia, which is our project, which I'll get to very shortly. And some other examples to mention are Padania in the Republic of Italy, which is northern Italy along the Po River. They basically say southern Italy is full of crime and corruption, and we're fine. And they're dealing with tax burdens, and our economy is wonderful. So why do we consider ourselves Italians anymore, and just lumping ourselves into these people that we really have little in common with? And Catalonia in Spain is another good example. And some of these regions compete independently in professional sports, especially soccer, where it's considered a key to recognition that you form your own national football team. And you know, we were used to thinking of nations in terms of states because we live in the age of nation states. But the reason that term is nation state is because these are states that are supposed to encompass or represent a particular nation. So that means the nation must be something that's outside the state, that either precedes it or is created by it or whatever the case may be. So we can be okay with a national football team. You can have a flag and whatever you want as long as it's voluntary. That's our key principle that we all believe so strongly in. The greatest example of this kind of voluntary cartography that happens all over the place is neighborhoods. Neighborhoods are wonderful. They each develop. You have a big city, and these neighborhoods each have their own little culture. They have their own. We came from New York, and you know, you really do develop quite a loyalty to your little pocket. You know, you don't really venturing out. You know, we live in Hell's Kitchen. Venturing to Soho is like a trip. You know, it's like a day trip. Just go to Soho and do their things and see what they have going on. And neighborhoods are for the most part voluntary. I mean, no one's legislating them, and yet they exist, and people have these strong affinities. And the beautiful thing about it being voluntary is that they're constantly changing. So as things change on the ground, this can be done by real estate developers, or it can be done just culturally as time goes on, or ethnic groups who claim an enclave. And the parable I'd like to give is Little Italy. So still, if you get in a cab, you see the official New York City government map that shows this nice prominent Little Italy downtown. The reality is it's gone. There's one street and a couple of restaurants that compose Little Italy. So if you go and you're like, oh, let's spend a day exploring Little Italy, you're going to see a couple of cheap pasta places, and then you're going to spend a lot of time reading Mandarin, because the Chinatown's expanded and it's taken over Little Italy and all that. So by doing this voluntarily, we're able to react to facts on the ground and be more nimble than the state. So last year, I presented on our regional project, Arcadia. This year, I wanted to expand the scope a little bit, because I know we have some attendees who are not in Arcadia, and though you should all move as soon as possible, I want you to be able to take these principles back to wherever you live and start promoting them. But Arcadia is our regional project to form a voluntary regional identity in the Atlantic Northeast. And that's, we generally, using the state boundaries, would be Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, and the Canadian Maritimes. Again, as a cross-border region, we think that this area, being predominantly rural, pastoral, and for a couple of other reasons, has more in common with itself than it does even with New England to the south, or New York to the west. Arcadia is a very low crime region, radically low crime, high peace index, high trust. It's almost like the 1950s around here, where you can leave your wallet out and chances are someone's going to return it to you, or just leave it there. Arcadia is much more sparsely populated, especially for the Northeast, is radically low density. And then there's certain cultural cues, from music to the way the towns are laid out. It's a low sprawl region compared to even New England to our south, which is a high sprawl suburban-based culture. We've maintained our small towns to a higher extent. So I consider myself an Arcadian, and I hope that through our efforts we can convince other people that that's a name that they'd like to adopt too. Some history of Arcadia. This is an early map of the historic French colony of Arcadia, which is probably the first question anyone has. Well, did you say Acadia, or are you trying to revive the French colony? Well, no, but we are taking it as a cue. Just like in the case of New Netherland and New Amsterdam, Arcadia was a thriving colony that was stamped out. It was actually really North America's first case of genocide of a people, that the English came in and took it over and forced the Acadians out. Now, the Acadians were never well loved even by France. They were the colony of the rascals, the people who wouldn't conform, who didn't obey the king, who might have had the wrong religion, and they kind of made a misfit society. And they were known as being semi-literate, but they were also known as being very hardworking and honest and generally very peaceful as well. So you can see New Scotland, when the Acadians were expelled, that island became Nova Scotia, New Scotland. We definitely recognize the Scottish, the very Northern European influence here, as opposed to further south is more predominantly Irish. The interesting thing about at least the U.S. Arcadian states is that they are the only states where French is the #2 language. So every state in the U.S., Spanish, Hawaii's, Hawaiian languages, but these states it's French. So that's different, and some of that comes from Acadia. Some of it comes from in-migration from Quebec over the years. But it's definitely a distinguishing feature, and it makes our culture a little bit different. When you drive into New Hampshire, you see bienvenue, and that's very Arcadian. One other note about the Acadians, while we're on the topic, is when they were expelled, they migrated down the Mississippi, many of them, and became the Cajuns. You see Acadian became Cajun, and that's where those people came from. So they were some of the original Acadians. Some more evidence for Arcadia is what was called the Wabanaki country. This was, again, a native, not necessarily an alliance, but it was a collection of tribes that considered themselves to be countrymen, the same way the Greeks did in their ancient city-states. And you'll notice it does cut New England right in two there, down around the Merrimack River. The Wabanaki were separate from some of the tribes further south and certainly to the west. And an interesting side note here, Lou Rockwell traces some of his ancestry to the Abenaki, which inhabited this region. So maybe he got a little bit of the Arcadian spirit too. So we have a unique challenge with our Arcadia project, which is New England is already a voluntary regional designation. It meets the definition, and And this gets, and so the question is, well, why fight it? Why not embrace New England? Well, people have different reasons. But first, just to reemphasize that when it comes to voluntary cartography, it's non-monopolistic, so we can be Arcadians and New Englanders at the same time if we want to be. Why do I prefer to be an Arcadian? Well, New England, it seems to a lot of people, is a region that is centered in Boston, and we are the outskirts. And it certainly doesn't take into account the Canadian Maritimes, which I think we have a lot in common with. So I don't really consider myself in the outskirts. In fact, I don't like Boston all that much. Some people do, and you go down there and might consider it your hub city. But I think the action is going on right here. That New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, these are the types of people, this is the culture that I moved for. I didn't move for Massachusetts culture or Connecticut or Rhode Island, and I see a difference. And maybe that's just me. I think other people, a lot of other people have joined in and sort of had the same idea. Go ahead.
Don't you hate the LinkedIn Greater Boston area?
Yeah. Yes, I joined the group.
No,
I joined the group. We are not Greater Boston. And you can like that culture. It's just a question: do you feel that label best represents you, or and you know, part of it is having our own media and not depending on Boston for the same way that I don't want us to depend on DC for our politics or New York for national news. Is to bring things closer to home in a region that makes sense to us. And as it applies to Atlantic Canada, you know, Atlantic Canada and the U.S. Arcadian states are really in the corners of their respective political federations, but they're not in a corner of the continent. So we're sort of like, oh, like Maine, that's like the end, you know. And people think in Canada that you go all the way out, you got to go through Quebec to get to these Maritimes. Well, we're right next to each other. We have a ton in common. So let's start promoting that. And there have been other efforts. There was a free market institute that started a project called Atlantica, which was purely a trade-based thing. It's just saying that we need to start trading across this border, and it'll be mutually beneficial. There's been in Vermont, the Second Vermont Republic has a proposal called Novacadia, which I thought sounded like going to the dentist, but we're all touching on the same thing. I ultimately don't really care what people decide to call it. I just care that it's recognized as something and that I can identify with it. Interestingly, New England the popular conception of New England was kind of an invented identity. There's a book called Inventing New England that goes into how our image of New England, like a lot of these images show, was somewhat manufactured. It certainly existed, but it was played up by the tourist industry in the 19th century as people started looking for, they stopped going to do tourism at like major features like the Niagara Falls or going to a state capital, and they started saying, well, we want something that's more homey and an escape from the city life. And New England kind of came out of that, and it certainly has been a historical region. It's been on maps since the 1600s, but it's not so firm as people might think. We can root for a team other than the Patriots. How does this tie into the Free State Project? Well, the FSP was founded as a minarchist organization. Expressly, it has to be. The whole point of the FSP is to move 20,000 libertarians, libertarian activists, to a small population state to have outsized influence. As a voluntarist, my motivation to move was different. And it was primarily to be with a group of wonderful, ethical, like-minded people, and to build a society. And I can't deny that some of the progress that's been made in the State House, but my focus is on building that society, building that culture, which is something that's less tangible for people, but I think is ultimately going to be what's most important, and it's going to be the great legacy of the Free State Project. The benefits of moving to Arcadia, and again, this by being voluntary, we can be a little less exclusive. Of course, the FSP, strategically it's nice for you to move to New Hampshire and get that New Hampshire ID, but if you want to be in southern Maine, you're still close enough. You can come to our meetups in Portsmouth. If you want to be just across the Vermont border, you know, if you want to be up in Burlington, whatever the case may be, you're still going to be closer and connected to our community, and that allows you the benefits of social life, entrepreneurship, you know, the ability to build businesses, and have influence by just being a greater number. Now there's the project, the Shire, and I know we're running low on time, so I'm trying to wrap up here, but the Shire is essentially a sort of a quasi-voluntary. A lot of people who don't believe in the state have started calling New Hampshire the Shire. But ultimately, you're still referencing the same thing. The Shire follows those same boundaries. So I don't find it so compelling. It's a good start. We shouldn't be using their labels for anything if we can avoid it. But really, Arcadia is a deeper concept that gets in, we think is tied into history and gets into has a deeper meaning. So I consider myself an Arcadian and a Porcupine. Not a free stater or a citizen of New Hampshire, you know, I just encourage all of you, whether you decide to move here or you go back to your respective regions, homes, find your identity, invest in it, and become a social entrepreneur. You know, spearhead it, start talking about it, because that's how change is made. We can take our cue from Ludwig von Mises. You know, sometimes it seems like these things are unchangeable, but all action is individual action. And it starts by individuals doing it differently. So if you start peppering your language with a reference or whatever, I'm an Ozarkan, if you live in the Ozarks, I'm an Arcadian, whatever the case may be, you know, you write it in posts, that has an effect. People, even at minimum, to say, well, you know, that's a little strange. What is that? And you guys were talking about, you started to use Arcadia. People say, well, what is that? So that starts a conversation. And once you start talking about Arcadia, start talking about libertarian, you know, give them the whole spiel. Now, of course, I think this is most powerful in media. So if you're really motivated to carry this forward, I have my efforts, along with some great team members, the Free Coast, which is our small publication for the Seacoast of New Hampshire, or Seacoast of Arcadia, and the Arcadian. And I hope to actually put more time myself into this going forward. Some other examples, Maine Magazine, wonderful. If you get a chance to pick it up, even though it's within the state borders of Maine, they have really remade Maine's identity. It's a glossy, beautiful, high design magazine, and it takes Maine straight out of that stodgy sort of New England archetype and makes it young and fresh and a place that you want to live and get involved in the food scene and just be there. And it's in like every hotel up and down the coast, and I think it really is having a wonderful impact. Another example is the New Hampshire Union Leader. Is considered largely responsible for New Hampshire being conservatarian as it is, because you know, a publisher bought the newspaper, and the editorial page had a certain slant, and it was subtle enough, but they said, we represent New Hampshire, we're the statewide publication, and this is the appropriate New Hampshire view. And you know, over the course of decades, that became the New Hampshire view. So you can have a tremendous impact by just being the place where that conversation happens. And if you're more relevant than the state boundaries, because you know you're serving this media market of New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine that is completely underserved by all the New England publications, then that could be, you know, you've created a platform for yourself to advance not only the regional ideas, but some great ideas about ethics as well. You know, if you get people thinking across borders, the borders will lose their power. My final thoughts are that I'd like us to free ourselves from being the mentality that we're the passive recipients of our regional identity. We are the creators of it, as we are in the marketplace, and I hope you will take this role wholeheartedly home with you. Thanks. anyone who wants to questions, I'll stay, and well, dinner's
Yeah,
served.
more
So.
technically.
Yeah.
I had that question about in a truly voluntary cartographic society.
Right.
Let's say you, I don't know, make something up here. You call yourself an Arcadia, and I call myself something else. Late for dinner. But seriously, if I know you're kind of somewhere at your east. I don't know your GPS coordinates, your grid square, whatever other definition. How would you envision, I know there's probably an infinite number of ways, like say I want to get from my house to your house. Can we assume that there's already some roads, whether they're government roads or private roads? How would a GPS system work? Or how would I get from A to B?
So this is who will build the roads, which is...
Well, not who will build the roads,
Right.
but I don't...
No, it's a legitimate question, and I think, obviously I focus a little bit more on the regional scale, and I think the closer you get to local, usually the less objection the volunteers can have to do it. And I think a lot of local place names were adopted voluntarily, and just because the state co-opted them doesn't make them illegitimate. And I think where they come in, they really want these vast territories. They want you to identify with a nation state or a U.S. state. So that is where I think the big battle has to happen. And I think questions like that, as we move toward a free society and you have private provision of roads, people are going to people will find technical solutions to that, and it would be conceded.
So they would happen, but nobody really has any idea what it would look like, not unless you're given the opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, anyone who builds a road can name a road, so I think when it comes to the interstates, that's something where I could very easily imagine a private company building like they built railways, and then you call your road what you want, and the GPS learns it, or the maps are updated, and that's all. Basically, the state is us. It's just us hurting each other. So if the state can do it, then it can be done. So the state assigns names to roads. Why do we observe those? Not because no one else can do it, but because they shove it down our throats. Because the Department of Defense is tied in the GPS system. Those are the official names. If they've suspended that marketplace.
Okay. Yeah. Well, the issue is that they shut out competition. What might happen had there been competition? I don't want to turn this into a constitutional debate, but I know, like for example, in the U.S. Constitution, it says one of the functions that they're allowed to do is post offices and post roads. Well, what's that mean? But that's a discussion for another time.
If you look at names of different countries in different parts of the world, like Deutschland versus Germany versus Hispania versus Spain, there's already multiple names for the same place, so it's going to solve problem in some way.
But that's just a translational language.
But people get by. They get by with, that's a good point.
I just wanted to know how you combat the 12 years of government school, where, like, I teach in a school and they're taught the states and the regions, and so I have to go in once a day and help out with this other class, and so in the whole, project, I said in front of the classroom teacher, now remember, kids, these are all imaginary lines. And she almost had a heart attack.
I was going to say, at risk of getting fired, show them some of these maps and start them thinking about things in a different way. And that's right. They're imaginary lines. Say these were written 400 years ago and by people who, many of whom hadn't even seen the lands that they were debating about, and it's silly.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
So, speaking of rescuing school children from indoctrination, I suppose some American school children might need to be rescued from the notion that the United States is an island with a straight line across the top. As a Canadian, it drives me a little nuts. But at the same time, like, your Arcadia goes across into Canada, but, we have that pesky national border thing that they seem very excited about.
I know. Well, it presents challenges on the ground. The reality of the state is, as we try to build an Arcadian identity, that our Arcadians have to go through some very scary checkpoints to visit with each other and maintain this culture. Yeah, in fairness, I lived in Canada and I saw Canada Island maps too. But yeah, I agree with you.
I wonder though, maybe like the FSP, like there's so many people, you know, every once in a while on the FSP forums, it's like, I live in Canada, how can I move to New Hampshire? It's like, wow.
Don't. I've heard it talk about the Liberal, was it Liberal Institute in Ontario? They were talking about a free island project in PEI. So that would dovetail very well with, let's move into Canadian Arcadia. We'll all be close enough and we'll start smuggling across the border and do what we do.
I'm wondering if you're at all familiar with
I've seen it, but not very good. It's kind of like a wiki-based.
Yeah, it's sort of hard to find the right description, but I'd like to say it's kind of like Wikipedia for geography. It's not a map per se. You can go by that. You go to the website and you can map on the website, right? And everybody has to have a agreed upon definition of what's going to be on the website. But it's really a database. It's in a database. It's not exactly on that map. A whole bunch of different maps. Different people, different organizations are generated based upon the same data set. And some of the stuff that you talk about seems like it's maybe fairly well dealt with. And there are a whole bunch of different names that a given place can have, or an object or map can have. To start with, you have a different name for every language. For example, and you have a primary name, and then you have, you're trying to keep track of all of them. You can have community names that are associated with things.
And these are all overlaid on maps?
And they can be all overlaid onto maps.
That's good. I haven't, in my research, I haven't seen examples of that done very well. So city data does this for neighborhoods, and you can kind of highlight your neighborhoods, but you know, design, I'm in marketing, so design's everything. So, you know, you're not going to get people really, it's not going to hit them unless it's in a very simple map. I tried to show some clear maps.
Is, like you said, the beauty of it is that you don't have to have one right answer.
Right.
Not one right map.
Right.
So that's sort of one of the difficulties that I have with it. There's not kind of a single right map.
I think.
How do I get something on the map? The map.
Right.
Wrong question to be asked.
Amen. Right. I think part of our activism along these lines, if you're so motivated, is creating different maps that just are outside these borders and you know, putting them online, envision states cut up if you want. I like secession, you know, and just start cutting through those borders and getting people thinking, well, this isn't permanent.
Yeah, just 3 quick observations. I mean, I guess one of the maps in itself are kind of a statist kind of concept. I mean, coming just from conquering and that kind of thing. I mean, really, you know, borders, especially in Europe after different world wars and everything, it kind of comes from that more than the regional kind of affinity that you're talking about. The second one, maybe one successful story of that is in Appalachia, where I have people, which is formed by, you know, migration during the 1600s and or 1700s. You know, Scots-Irish came into Pennsylvania because there's some place that would take them, and then they went south.
Right.
I mean, that was, I don't know, Scots-Irish, so I didn't say that, but yeah, but that's, you know, there's a kind of a strong affinity inside of that group as being Appalachian more than being from West Virginia or something like that. And then the last thing is just, you know, when I moved up here to New Hampshire, people started noticing people kind of call the people from Massachusetts flatlanders. And you've heard that where you are, but
yes.
You know, even if they used to live there, it's like, oh yeah, they're from Flatlands, don't worry about them. So there definitely is a border kind of right around.
I've started calling them all Southeast too.
Yeah, yeah. So.
But yeah, that's one of the interesting things about you know, neighborhood maps in the case, you know, in a lot of these regions they exist, but people don't necessarily document them because there's, you know, I guess that's on our time, and you don't have an official bureau of.
Yeah, but what do you suggest when people do with it? I mean, it's okay, people think of themselves as Appalachian or Arcadian, and what?
I think it has, when you are forming civic organizations or media is when it's most relevant. So, you know, start trying to make connections and you know, do regional media.
Well, I was going to say, I'm from Western Mass, and everywhere I go to Texas, Colorado, Florida, here. Even today, 3 or 4 times, like, oh, you're from Boston, huh?
Yeah.
And like I deal with these farmers in Colorado and stuff, and they live 60 miles from Denver. And I say, hey, how's things in Denver, guys?
Right.
Well, we're not from Denver. And I go, I'm not from Boston.
If you look at
no element whatsoever of it.
Arcadia is based partly on the Acadian forest ecoregion. And if you look at how it actually is shaped, it actually skips the seacoast of New Hampshire because that's influenced by the ocean. And it goes down into the Berkshires and Western Mass. So yeah, you geographically at least have much more in common with us than with them.
What's the advantage is or disadvantages of, say, this Arcadia is bigger than the states versus like smaller like micro-regions, like, you know, our end of our small town versus, you know, the south end of our small town and stuff like that. I mean,
well, you can see, well, I'm personally working on 2 levels, so
right.
You got the seacoast and then Arcadia. So when I get time, and that's the royal eye because Vanessa does all my graphic design, I'd like to create a map that shows Arcadia with all its like constituent subregions. And you know, you got the seacoast, Merrimack Valley, you got Monadnock, you got the North Country, Northeast Kingdom, and Vermont. It goes on. Yeah, I think those. That's where like your daily life happens. Like if we go from Portsmouth to the Merrimack Valley, that's like a trip. But going to Exeter is like they're still in our little region. So yeah, I agree with you. Any questions up there? Okay, thank you very much.